Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our supported decision-making training series. This is the 8th of our series, and we'll talk about in just a minute what our today's topic will be. But I'm Vicki Suter, the Director of Rights and Advocacy. I just want to take a moment to welcome you to our training. Next slide.
Alrighty, just a bit of housekeeping here before we get started. So today's session has been approved for one social work CEU. In order to receive that CEU, you will need to be on the training for its entirety and complete the survey that I will send out at the end of the training. And I'll send this out in the chat box. So if you guys are looking for the chat box, at the top of your team screen to the right, there's a little bubble with some lines through it. You can click on that to pop the chat out. And even if you're not looking for social work CEUs, we still really appreciate your feedback. That's how we improve for future trainings. I also wanted to let everyone know that we are recording this training. It will be shown later today for our 6 p.m. session, and it'll also be available on the OCHN website under recorded trainings, and I can drop the link in the chat for you guys, and we'll also discuss that later. As far as questions, we'll be monitoring the chat, so if you have any, feel free to pop those questions in there, or right next to the chat bubble, there is a little face with a hand next to it. You can click on that to raise your hand as well. And that concludes my housekeeping. So Vicki, back to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. So thanks for attending our session today. I think you're going to find it a fantastic topic, and we have a fantastic speaker, and I'll introduce him in just a minute. But I want to take an opportunity to thank our partners, the Development Disability Council, in particular, Mary Sheehan-Bugard, who has really helped us bring this training series alive, helped us get the presenters, as well as helped me develop the topic and things that are important that folks might want to hear about, the various tools to do supported decision making. So big thanks to her, and then also to Kimberly Hoga from Detroit Wayne Integrated Health Network, who's helping us get the word out to our Tri-County area so that many people can attend and benefit from these trainings. OCHN does have a goal related to supported decision making, and we do have a local work group that meets monthly to discuss topics about supported decision making and the things that we can do to move that forward. This training series really is one of the goals of that work group, and so I'm really proud of the work that they're doing, and we're excited about the good reception that we've had for these trainings. I'm also part of a statewide work group that's working on supported decision making, and we just had a meeting today, Mary and I, with that subcommittee. We're developing a toolkit or a resource kit that will help people be aware of and know the various tools that they possibly could use to support themselves or their loved one regarding supported decision making. So that probably won't be out to the 1st of next year, but we're moving along on that. We're really excited about that project. So we look forward to that coming out, and look forward to the efforts of not only the statewide work group, but our local one as well. Next slide. So our topic today is about how assistive technology can help us in a supported decision making or leading the most independent life that we can. And we have a wonderful speaker. It would probably take me all day to give you all of his credentials. He's a fantastic person, first of all, but he's been an advocate for many, many years, super knowledgeable about so many things. Norm Delisle is here. He's a policy consultant for the Michigan Department. I don't know what MDRC stands for. Norm, you can help me with that.
Disability Rights Organization, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I always forget some of the acronyms. So I'm just really excited that Norm's with us. He's, you could probably ask him any question. He'd probably have a good answer for you. So really excited about him being with us. So I want to welcome him, and thank you, Norm, for being willing to present to us today.
Thank you, Vicki. I appreciate the opportunity. The MDRC holds the state's Assistive Technology grant, which is a systems level grant. And one of the things that we do are demonstrations of specific pieces of AT for specific individuals. And we're just recently adding to those demonstrations a variety of things. But the things I'm talking about today are some of the pieces that we haven't been able to demonstrate until the pandemic became a reality and it was possible to do these demonstrations remotely. The thing that I want to emphasize in regard to living inclusively is that personal control is personal power. I'm going to focus on 3 areas in which assistive technology can be useful in supporting real community inclusion for people with SMI, SUD, and IDD. These are AT to support emotional self-regulation, AT to support executive functions, and AT to support personal safety. To the exact extent that we can transfer control over a person to supporting the person's personal control, you will reduce the need for complicated control-based interventions. The next slide. Feel free to ask questions today. I will try to answer them either right now or hang on a second, I hit the wrong button. I have attached a resources page, which probably could answer many of your questions, but it's gotten pretty big over the time I've been preparing this. I want you to put your questions in the chat box, and I will get to them as I can. And if I'm unable to answer a question today, and you leave your email address in the chat, I will get back with you and try to answer your question then. Next slide. The MDRC mission is as follows. MDRC cultivates disability pride and strengthens the disability movement by recognizing disability as a natural and beautiful part of human diversity, while collaborating to dismantle all forms of oppression and stigma. Our mission is what we believe, and it's reflected in our work. Our mission is not a marketing meme, but a statement of purpose and a desire for allies in its work. Next slide. Not all assistive technology has a battery or needs to be plugged in. In fact, a lot of AT is low tech, like the rainbow pill organizer on the left corner of the screen. It could be useful for someone who has difficulty in remembering to take their medications. Also shown on this slide is a doorknob gripper attached to a round doorknob. Frankly, I'm 74 and I am beginning to find things like doorknob levers more and more useful. This is a nice, simple one. A person is also a picture of a person using a walker, and there are a lot of mobility assistive devices. And I think if you live long enough, you know you're going to need these. Also, this kind of AT can prevent falls, and falls are a leading reason for hospitalization in older people, and they can be a reason for hospitalization in young people who have mobility impairments. Next slide. In choosing AT, the use essentially the same kind of rules or guides or heuristics that you would use for any part of person-centered planning. You start with a person's goal. What is it that they want to do? You research device and app options and ask for a free trial, even if one isn't listed as available. We have found over the years that particularly if the piece costs some money, that it's well worth your while to ask for the right to use it for a month and see whether or not it actually works. We need to understand the context of the AT use. A piece of assistive technology is not a solution to some specific problem. It only becomes that solution when a specific individual finds that they can use it to achieve their goal. And finally, you need to review your resources, financial, friends and family, for setup and installation help or programs that might help, and the all-important warranties and repair capabilities that sometimes people forget about when they're looking hard for a specific solution. Next slide. Although we tend to think of AT as a solution to a problem, say a phone app, for example, the reality is that you can't support real inclusion without some attention to the context in which the person's trying to solve the problem they see. What we're after is to enable reliably supported personal agency. There's a book called The Secret World of Weather, and this is a person who's been involved in meteorology for a long time and also personal control over issues like making judgments about weather. And what he's done basically is tell you how to make judgments about your personal microclimate so that you can, say, avoid getting wet when you go out to have a good time outside. And Tom, you need to shut up. We have a feral cat out in the backyard, and periodically it shows up, and our dog gets very upset about that. He provides you with information about how to make judgments, whether or not you're going to get rain in your backyard today. And to some extent, the system that we have for person-centered planning is like the system that we have for regional weather. And what we want is for the individual to be able to make judgments about the use of AT in their own personal world. One of the things that we want to change in terms of our thinking is we need to create a possibility space instead of a fence enclosing reduced opportunity. And a lot of planning models, like person-centered planning and logic models in general, are designed to create a framework. They're not designed to specify what goes on inside that framework. If we can, I'd like to give you an example of that with a 3-minute video from a fellow named Dave Snowden. He's not the Snowden who broke open what the NSA was doing with our privacy, but he is an expert in how large systems function, and he's created something that is funny and also interesting. So if we can play that.
Let's imagine, if you can, that you've got to organize a party for a bunch of 11-year-old boys.
Yep, sound is good, but if you could expand it so it's larger, that'd be great, Vicki.
In nature. Well, if you assume the party's chaotic, the children are acting at random, you might as well buy the drugs and alcohol so the children can go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Your house may burn down in the process, but what does that matter? All property is theft, and it was socially constructed in the first place. I have friends in California who've tried this. I don't recommend it. The recovery cost is high, but it's a legitimate approach. On the other hand, the one we'll be more familiar with is the ordered systems approach. Here, it's of critical importance to construct clearly articulated learning objectives in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should, of course, be aligned with the mission statement for education in the society to which you belong. Ideally, you should print the learning objectives off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropping into ponds, and place those around the room where you're going to hold the party. You then produce a project plan for the party. The project plan should have clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. Once you've done that, the senior adult can start the party with a motivational videotape. After all, you don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives of the party itself. And then they should use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the objectives of the party and to show the children how pocket money is linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Now, of course, the third approach, the complexity approach, is even simpler. Here we draw a line in the sand known as a boundary in complexity theory, and we turn to the children and say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. And one of the things you learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries, because rigid boundaries have a habit of becoming brittle and breaking catastrophically. We then use catalytic probes, and I'm deliberately using the jargon of complexity theory now. Football, a videotape, a barbecue, a computer game, something which will stimulate a pattern of activity which is called an attractor. And if it's a beneficial attractor, we stabilize it, we amplify it. If it's a negative attractor, we dampen it or destroy it fairly quickly. So what we do is we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And in that simple phrase, we see the promise of complexity theory for organizations and government alike.
All right. It's worth looking at twice because he compresses an awful lot into 3 minutes. One of the things that that his institute, called the Kinethan Institute, does is it focuses a lot of energy on scaffolding as compared with frameworks. When someone is trying to accomplish something, they often analyze it or think about it through a framework. It helps them to grasp some concepts, but it doesn't help them to build it any more than a blueprint produces the building. You have to have a scaffold to produce a building, and you have to have a scaffold to produce a capable, competent, comprehensive, person-centered plan. One of the things that that comes out of this is thinking of what you're organizing as a possibility space, not a set of linear causal links to get you from point A to point B. There's a lot of things that we do with family members, for example, where we're supporting their choices by, frankly, by telling them that they have the right to make those choices, and by trying to get them to think about what might be possible rather than what they can't do. And person-centered planning is at its best when it does this. The methods that are used for person-centered planning don't automatically produce this, but it is a much better way to think about what you want to do in supporting someone to live inclusively, to think of the environment, city, the rural area, wherever it is that they live, as a framework of possibilities and not just a set of outcomes. Next slide. The real point of AT is using a little bit of the language that Dave Snowden used. It's coherent engagement. A person has a coherent engagement when they get meaning from their environment, when they think that the meaning gives them some understanding of that environment, and when they are able to do things based on the meaning and the comprehensibility that they have. In other words, they have a coherent engagement with their environment, and when they don't, they identify what all of us think of as pain points, because they don't know what to do about a specific part of the life they're living. A person using AT is building a coherent interaction over time with the uncertainty in life. I think most of the people who are participating in this have a smartphone, and we all know that it was a pain in the neck to get to learn how to use the smartphone. And when we come to decide that we want to use an app like Facebook or whatever, it doesn't really matter, we also go through another learning process, and we accept that as part of the empowerment we expect to have when we use that smartphone. We have to think the same way about inclusion in the community, that it's about the individual grasping the power that might be available through a learning process that gives them more control over the uncertainty in their life. Next slide. Recovery, in my book, recovery is a lot broader than it tends to be inside behavioral health. I think of recovery as a general way for human beings to deal with the uncertainty of life. So I've defined it as recovery is the personal management of barriers to autonomy and free choice through effort, learning, habit building, effective ritual, natural supports, and the tools available through support systems, including AT. Dave Snowden has one of his things is about ritual, and he tells a story about a huge problem that a trucking company had in the northern part of Scandinavia. the drivers would drive sometimes for 10 or 12 hours straight, and they would arrive at the depots where they were going to drop off whatever they were carrying. And 4 out of 5 injuries that they suffered in the course of their work occurred in the 15 minutes after they got to the depot and started helping the staff there to unload the truck. And they decided that the reason why there was such a high rate of injury was because the drivers had just spent the last 10 or 12 hours driving, and their brains were kind of cued into the things that are important in driving and weren't cued into the things that are important in unloading. So they made mistakes. They slipped. They dropped things on their toes. There was a lot of things that happened that produced these injuries. So they came up with a little ritual where they had to put on a warming vest before they could start unloading the truck. And this was enough to get rid of 2/3 of the injuries that they suffered in the course of being drivers in this trucking firm. And Dave says that the ritual's job is to shift your brain from where it is right now to someplace else. And it doesn't have to be, the warming vest is a nice idea because everybody wants to put one on in northern Norway. But it was more important that you shift your brain state away from where it's been rolling along for 12 hours to something new. And that vest was enough to do that. Rituals are far more important than we give them credit for. And they're especially important when you're dealing with a problem that's just kind of a tape loop in someone's head. Finding the right kind of ritual isn't so much knowing how to defeat the tape loop as it is doing something that's genuinely different. If you've ever had a problem with an earworm where a song just kept rolling around in your brain and you couldn't get it to stop, one method for doing that is to start doing arithmetic calculations in your brain. It shifts the focus of your brain from the earworm to stuff that's incompatible with the earworm. And it's a reasonably, I have a lot of trouble with earworms. It's a reasonably effective way to do that. Next slide. Emotional self-regulation is important for everyone, but it's especially important for individuals that are trying to build inclusive support in a community. And I started tracking these apps, frankly, about the time that apps in general started showing up on phones. And the ones that were there originally were largely, except maybe for journaling apps, were largely not very useful, and they were also not very accessible. And that stuff has changed dramatically, but the good news is that there are many more apps that have a kind of a base capability. The bad news is there's just an enormous number of them, and finding them can be very difficult to finding one that actually works for you. It can be a tough thing to do. I've put together a resource page, and you'll notice at the bottom of this slide that there's a link. The resource page is getting to be pretty long. I put in a set of content links that go to the big pieces. So there's one about coherence and how you achieve it, and there's one about emotional self-regulation. There's one about executive function, and there's also one about that I can't remember right now. About pretty much everything else. And this page is a Google's doc, and I think you all should be able to get to it by clicking on that link. But if you can't, I'd be happy to convert it into a Word document and email it to you. Apps that focus on emotional self-regulation tend to be ones that give you, like say a journaling app, that give you an opportunity to reflect on what's going on around you. And they don't have to be written, and no one's going to read them. So you can use them any way you want, including with your voice. You can say what you want and record it. They allow you to build rituals and habits, and they also allow for the accumulation of personal data, which you can personally use to see how things are going and to get some insight into the self-regulation issues that you have. My personal one, I'm a person with lived experience. My personal one was depression, severe depression, and PTSD. And PTSD is a toughie. I think there's a fair number of people on this call that have some experience with it, and depression is kind of my own personal example of a tape loop that makes it hard to break out of. All of them allow sharing. Some are tied to clinical support, and I can only talk to you about a few examples. There's more in the resources page, but they'll give you the flavor of it. Next slide. The best specimen example of an emotional self-regulation app is the Veterans Administration's PTSD Coach app. When it first came out, it kind of set a standard for other things, but it's become more capable than it was then. There's a mobile version and an online version, and it allows you to play around with the areas that you want tools to help you, to support you. And they've done a nice job with that. And even if you don't think it will have much use, I would click on the online one and take a look at the way they've got it laid out. It's very well thought out, and it goes way beyond military PTSD uses. It's generally helpful for anyone who's experienced trauma. And in my book, that's most people who have severe mental illness or IDD or SUD, that there's always a trauma component to it, or almost always a trauma component to it. Even if you, for example, you started using opioids because of chronic pain, over time, chronic pain produces PTSD symptoms. So even there, it's worth taking a look at something like the PTSD Coach app, even if you don't feel that you have PTSD. There is a fair amount of emphasis out there in the app world on cognitive behavioral therapy. MindShift is an app that is focused on young people, but it's a decent app for using cognitive behavioral therapy by yourself. There was I don't know why I have Android twice in the slide, but I must have missed that. Even if you are, I guess, skittish about using CBT in a therapeutic situation, it's worth your while to look at it as a tool you can use on your own and try to get comfortable with the idea, because CBT is a generally useful tool. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a generally useful tool for dealing with any kind of emotional self-regulation issue. And in the SUD community, there's a pattern of tools that arose originally out of AA, but nowadays there's a broader focus and a less narrow community for SUD, and they go under the heading of 24 hours a day, and it's a decent set of tools. And there's a lot of other things that go along with it. It's kind of like an SUD version of the VA PTSD Coach. Any of these tools are decent places to start. If you don't like them, I've got a whole bunch of other ones there that you can take a look at. Next slide. Executive function is one of the human capabilities that is important for living inclusively in any social system or any community. In the West, executive functions typically include focusing attention, working memory, planning, time management. Those skills we associate with effective work. The skills begin to expand dramatically in adolescence and continue to improve for many decades. There used to be a thought that it was all done about the time you were 25. Now that I'm 74, I look on the idea that I was at my best when I was 25 with some skepticism. But it's also not the case that we don't start using executive functions until we're adolescents. Very small children, basically in the latter part of the first year, use their frontal lobes, which is the place where executive functions reside or operate. Actually, they don't reside there. And they just don't do any of the things they'll be doing with them when they're adolescents. And so it looks to us like they're pretty volatile and attention deficit disorder and so on and so forth. As you can probably guess, executive functions and ESR work together to expand personal recovery. It's very difficult, even if you've developed good controls for any emotional self-regulation if you have. It's pretty hard to advance your inclusive membership in the community and building your personal agency and having the kind of life you want unless you develop some level of executive functions. And everybody has ones they're good at and ones they're not good at. That's just the way of it being a human being. Next slide. All right, I had to make some choices about executive function support. I tried to pick two that are virtually universal because I think we all use them to some extent. You can make sticky notes do just about anything you want for whatever you want. And if you don't use them, they're well worth using. I think I have a kind of ADD myself, and sticky notes and to-do lists are the only thing that prevent me from, I don't know, running into a wall. They are just universally useful tools. And these days, you can get a sticky note to do anything. You can make them, record them as words. You can stick them up on your desktop screen if you have a computer, or you can put them in your phone, or you can go out and buy sticky notes and stick them up on walls. I have one that I use in the evening when my thinking is not what I would hope it would be, that I use in the bathroom to remind me to do things before I go to bed. And so these two are like universal tools that you can use to make do. They're free, a lot of them. There's hardly a reason to get one you have to pay for. Maybe if you're working in an organization that has their own specific to-do list app that allows people to share things and that kind of thing. But if you're just doing it for yourself, there's a million of these things. And I have many, many other categories of stuff. I ran across one today that focused on using Alexa, which is an Amazon tool that you find. You can have it on your phone. You can get these little speakers. That uses it for alarms, and you could use it for all kinds of alarms. Almost anything you can think of, and you can do it by just telling Alexa to create it and save it for you. And then there's one of the things that is very useful in the disability community generally is text-to-speech apps, and conversely, speech-to-text apps. And we've been at MDRC have been looking for new versions because there are some significant problems with the most general form that these apps take, which is something called AAC, which stands for Alternative and Augmentative Communications Devices. They've been around a long time. When I was working at Protection and Advocacy in the 80s, we would regularly have cases involving AAC and either just getting it to be available for people. And I can still remember in the 70s seeing the first communication board that I ever saw and realizing how tremendously useful such a board could be. Today, they're much more sophisticated. They're also a lot more expensive. We had a staff demonstration of a relatively new one called App to Speak. For my money, it's the best one I've run across for general use. It's extremely flexible, and you can make new bits and pieces for it on the fly. Say if you decide you want to go to a museum or you want to go to a concert or something, you can make stuff to talk about on the fly as you need it. You can use your own photographs to set them up. It's very nice. The other thing is that most AACs are run on a subscription model these days. And this one is a one-time cost. It's not cheap. It's $180. But if you want to get a sense of what you should be looking for when you're looking at other text-to-speech or speech-to-text apps, this is the one I would look at on either iOS or Android. Get a sense of what it's capable of doing, and then look for those things in your search for other kinds of less expensive ones. Next slide. Personal safety obviously has become a lot bigger deal in the last couple of years than it was before. But for most of us, there is either a time in our life or a general sense that we need to pay attention to our personal safety as we go about living in the world. My background is such that I have a lot of experiences that most people would consider to be pretty risky. And I think this is true. I tell people that the reason why I have such a large library of extremely risky experiences that I somehow survived is not because I was brave, but because I was depressed and had ADD. And it makes that combination makes it difficult to make good choices until you've had enough experiences to force you to pay attention to what you're doing. Personal safety is a big deal in inclusion in the community. And the issue of what's called in the disability community, the dignity of risk, is a critical balance for the level of control that systems exert when they're dealing with individuals who take risky behaviors. I think we all know, some of us know from personal experience, that parental authority-based models of imposing safety produce sabotage and rebellion. It's kind of the definition of adolescence. Better is to have personally motivated steps to ensure personal safety that works best over the long term. I think behaviorism has a deserved bad reputation because it takes away the incentive to behave because you want to do it and puts it in somebody else's hands. But if you're external to a person and they're doing something dangerous, say SUD, it can be difficult to come up with a way to support personally empowering methods, especially in the face of addiction. I was in the 70s, before they had the modern era of substance abuse therapy and certification. I was a substance abuse therapist for several years. And I noted that even though I was the person who got everybody who was court ordered for substance abuse therapy, and which is an interesting group of people. And I did learn that there were some individuals for whom, especially people with a lot of experience in the criminal justice system, for whom it was very difficult to come up with a supportive system that would allow them to control their criminal behavior, and some of that involved drugs. But I also learned that there are an awful lot of people who are addicts who maintain their addiction one way or another because they're part of a community whose purpose is to procure, use, and share the substance. Say heroin addicts, for example. That doesn't mean that they can't find a way to break out of that, but it does mean that in the same way that alcoholics often learn that they have to stay out of bars if they want to stay sober, that you're talking about building capabilities that don't exist inside that addict community in some other community. And I don't know if you've ever been dumped from one community where you were reasonably comfortable into another one which you did not understand. But that is not to do that without support is risky. I think along with that, I would say that the IDD community, as it has moved into the larger American social environment, has developed a subgroup like every other human community that has addiction problems. In particular, I think that there are individuals with IDD who have real problems with alcohol, and that we are not very good at talking about that. We're also not very good at coming up with support programs for a group that needs them as much as any other human community does. And yet we're not really set up to do that. We tend to do what is euphemistically referred to as co-occurring disorders by taking two pretty separate programs and kind of doing parallel play with the individual and hoping that they will figure out a way to integrate those two things together. So if I was going to pick something out for you to look at in the system in which you operate, it would be how we can truly integrate SUD and other disability support systems in real time, in real lives, in the real community. SUD is phenomenally tied to dangerous behavior, and it can be tied to it because people choose a life of criminality in order to make a living. It can be tied to it because it deteriorates the executive functions that we need to not make bad choices. There's a lot of reasons to be concerned about SUD and dangerous behavior. And there are also forms of brain injury that reduce the ability to make use of our skills and capabilities. And I will give you, I started out working in the 70s in a medical clinic that worked with families that had kids with severe brain injury. And I will give you this one little piece of information if you aren't already aware of it. And that is that anybody who has a brain injury, regardless of what the source of it is, has a limit on how much they can stress their brain. And I think of it as a type of fatigue. And for people who don't identify as individuals with disabilities, we tend to think of that fatigue as something we have to fight through and work through until we get to the glorious land of whatever it is we're trying to do. But brain fatigue can't be fought through. And in particular, if an individual has a brain injury, once they hit that point of fatigue, they can't make good choices until they rest. So I would suggest that when you're dealing with someone who has behavior problems, especially if they show up late in the day, that you think in terms of brain fatigue is one of the characteristics that might be making it tougher for them to make real use of what they have when they're at their best. Next slide. There are a lot of, I have found these surprisingly useful, even though you do get a lot of things that you can't actually use. But environmental alerts, it's less so now since I'm not traveling to work every day, but I save myself a lot of gridlock by having an Everbridge app that tells me when the police report an accident on the main roads going into Lansing. It used to be called Nixle. Everbridge apparently bought Nixle, and Ingham County, for example, uses Everbridge. Every county uses something. A second class of personal safety app that's worth having are some weather app that is accessible to the individual who you're supporting. There are a zillion of them out there, and most of them, at least to recently, try to make them more accessible than they've been in the past. Frankly, they weren't accessible for a long time. Weather apps can tell you about storms. They can tell you about fires. They can tell you about hurricanes, although I hope to God we do never have to make use of a hurricane alert. Certainly this summer has shown us that we need to have storm alert capability and high rain capability because particularly in Southeast Michigan, they've really suffered from the changes in weather that we've had over the last couple of years. There's also a variety of personal safety apps. These are many in number. A primary use is for individuals who are dealing with stalkers or have been in abusive relationships and are trying to get out of them. They're generally useful for anyone who lives in an environment outside of their home where they might run into difficulties, maybe because of the neighborhood or because of some issue in the larger environment in which they live. But they're worth looking at to see whether or not you have a use for them. And I can tell you that there are a lot of home safety devices besides the fire alarm and the carbon monoxide alarm, both of which everybody should have wherever it is that they live. There are also a generation of new devices and apps that allow you to see who's at your front door without opening the door. I have a little one that I use to track animal movement through our yard, deer and what have you. It's just a camera, and it can see animals in the dark, and it will record movement, and it won't record anything else. So we have a feral. I said earlier we had a feral cat, and the cat had 2 kittens, and they've been starting to move away from the house. And I've decided that since I don't see them every day, that I would set up the camera so I can check to see whether they are still using our garage as an apartment. But you can use them for a lot of other things. There are many, many devices out there, and the real problem is picking ones that fit your need. We have a couple that allow us to turn lights off and on at the 2 ends of our house. And we do that because often we'll get in bed and watch a little TV, and then it just I've left the lights on in the kitchen. So you can use it for something as easy as that, but you can also use it for avoiding like steps that you can't see at night. You can tell Alexa, for example, to turn on the lights to your downstairs so you don't slip on something or miss something that's been left on the steps. All of these things are involved in personal safety, and they're all worth taking a look at. And at least the basic ones, like plugs, for example, that you can use on lights, are not awfully expensive, especially if you're only using them for parts of your house where there's some real risk to you. But, and I can't emphasize this too much, there is a wide variety of personal safety apps that have arisen out of the desire for individuals to be able to protect themselves from abusers. And they, in addition to that, they also have some use for individuals who are dealing with larger environmental danger issues. I think that one of their uses is, because a lot of them aren't terribly expensive, some of them are free, is that if you want to deal with emotional self-regulation, and being a person who had a history of PTSD and depression, I can tell you that worry degrades your ability to have a pleasant life, and that things that you can do that eliminate worry are well worth taking a look at. I'd like to move to the next slide. I'm going to sum up here, and then I'm going to talk about a few other things. And then I'll be open for questions if you have them right now. But I want to tell you again that if you think of a question later, feel free to send me the question, and I will do what I can to find an answer for you. The thing to remember is that no technology solves a human problem. Every technology has its upside and its downside. And we often take on a technology because we can see that it's going to solve something for us right now. And it's only after a period of time that we figure out that it also has some problems. The second thing I want to emphasize is that the technology is a scaffold, not a solution. It's not like replacing a broken part. It's something that we will use and we will get better at using, but that takes time. And if it doesn't allow us to embrace the freedom that should be our birthright, then it's of no use to us, even if it's of use to everyone else on the planet. Don't think of an app as a hammer to pound in a nail. I think a better metaphor might be to use the hammer to pound in a nail outside in a raging blizzard below zero temperatures. You need to know where the hammer is. You need clothing that will give you protection from the cold. The nail might stick to your fingers if it gets cold enough. And if you drop the nail in the snow, you have a new order of problem. The need for person-centeredness is just as great in finding an effective app as it is in choosing a support person who helps the individual every day. Both of these are equally complex and demanding. Another thing to remember is that when a person uses an app, they are engaged in a support ecosystem, which may or may not be of any real use to them. And one of the supports you can give someone who's trying to live inclusively in the community is to help them manage that ecosystem, customer service, warranties, getting things fixed. And to remember that even if a solution isn't immediately obvious, there are always more possibilities out there than we know. And I've learned this over the years. Someone out there, somewhere out there rather, is a bunch of people trying to solve similar problems to the person you are supporting. And survivor communities have exploded in the last 22 decades to include national communities for people who have extremely rare diseases, and that tie them to people that are researching treatments, and that also tie them to the kind of capabilities that people develop when they are trying to solve a problem that's rare and unheard of, and are more than willing to share what they have learned and what they don't know. And these survivor communities, as they used to be called, should really be broadened to include anyone who has an identifiable problem with living and that needs support or help in dealing with this particular problem. I can't tell you the number of times that I have found a solution to a problem simply by asking a community of people who focus in their daily life on solving just that kind of difficulty. Some of you may be familiar with multiple chemical sensitivity as a community. It's not a common problem, but when it exists, it makes it very difficult for people to live within the framework of standard American society without a lot of alteration in what they're exposed to and how they deal with when they have flare-ups, and it's been very difficult for them because it's rare, and there's not wasn't until fairly recently an identifiable diagnosis, and people were told that they were crazy, or they were told that it was all in their head, or I've watched that particular community because I ran into people who dealt with MCS in the late 70s, and there was effectively nothing for them in the way of support. And now there are national organizations and there are small communities that grow up not in any one particular location, but across the board, and people help one another to deal with and come up with ways of dealing with issues that arise because of exposure to some trigger for them. This is also true, as I'm sure all of you know, for trauma generally. And I tend to think of trauma as a part of any major or significant struggle with inclusion and living in the larger society. Next slide. I'm going to give you a little more information about the AT demonstrations that MDRC does. One of the things that we can pay for out of the AT grant, we can't pay for equipment, for example. The feds won't allow us to do that. But one thing we can pay for that helps people is that we can find, if they have a specific need for AT and they aren't sure what they should do with that or what kind of AT they should get, we can help an individual to decide on 4 or 5 examples of that AT for that problem. And then we can do a demonstration of those 4 or 5 forms of AT. They can make a decision about which one they would like to try based on their experience. And we've had, there are a huge number of AT advisors, and it can be very difficult for an individual who has a specific issue to be able to make a decision amongst all the alternatives. So this is a reasonably popular way for people to access information about the kind of AT that they might want to get. These, obviously, we've had to change the way we do demonstrations as a result of the pandemic, and we have a system set up now that allows us to have a conversation with somebody about what alternatives they want to look at, and then we can send them a temporary use of an AT device, like mostly an iPad, and then we can use a Zoom along with the iPad to demonstrate for the individual how these different alternatives can be used. And then they can make a decision based on what they experienced, and we're getting pretty good at accommodating different disabilities, including visual disabilities, so that people can get a decent shot at understanding what these different alternatives offer and make a decision that will allow them to pick a choice. And because so many of the solutions do involve apps or relatively inexpensive equipment, it's possible to try one thing, and if it doesn't work out all that well, you can try another one. These I have put in links to the AT grants page on demonstrations, and there's an application to fill out, and we take each one of them seriously, and we, in fact, this presentation has allowed the AT project to begin to get a grasp of how we would do AT demonstrations in this enormous universe of apps around emotional self-regulation and executive function and personal safety. MDRC is involved in projects that with CILs where these are issues for many people that get CIL services, and certainly they are important issues for people getting CMH services. And we're going to look to trying out some of the things I've talked to you about today with Veteran Support Group in a month or two, using demonstrations and getting the pain points out of the process of making these things available to people who can certainly use them. And some of you are familiar with Jim Ho, I'm sure, and I'm going to try to run some demos through Jimho as well, because they have access to a sizable group of people who have issues related to these kinds of potential assistive technology demonstrations. Next slide. I have been working in the disability community since 1970. I came back from Vietnam in December of 1969, and immediately blew the $3,000 that I had saved on instruments for a bar band. And that lasted about 4 months. It was really more performance art than it was a business. And both the keyboard player and I were looking for something to do that was worthwhile. And we ran across a medical clinic that worked with families, supportive families who had kids with severe brain injury. And these were all families that hadn't put their kids in institutions or taken them out. And there was no support for these families anywhere outside of institutions. That was the way in which support was provided in the 70s until the final deinstitutionalization. And it was quite an experience to learn that. And I picked up a lot of stuff about the kind of systems level of support for people with severe disabilities. And I also recognized that I should view the depression that I'd had during adolescence and over the 2 or 3 years after I got back from Vietnam, the PTSD, as disabilities and not as personal failings. And so it was good for me, and I dedicated my time and effort to learning as much as I possibly could over the years about disability and how you support real choice for an individual who has severe disabilities, especially ones that other people don't understand very well. You can, my email address is there. I also have a Twitter account and a Facebook account, and I produce some blogs, which I will give short descriptions to. The Change Strategy blog is more about the kind of things that I mentioned when I was talking about Dave Snowden, and there's a lot of stuff about advocacy and how advocacy works, not as a reason to do it, but as a way of interacting with systems that aren't particularly compatible with your life. Also, there's an enormous amount of information about disability, and I try to keep up on issues through a blog called Disability Cosmos Daily, and I generally post 3 to 6 items a day, and they cover a broad range of things. And if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you can subscribe to that. The Michigan AT program has its own blog. There's an enormous amount of information in it, and including an awful lot of stuff related to webinars that we have done in the past, and that constitutes a body of work, most of which is still useful. Recently, I guess partly because of the pandemic, there's been a great interest in gardening, and assistive technology for gardening is an extremely well-developed body of knowledge and lessons. And so if you have any interest in, there's a lot of things. We have stuff on parenting. If you have a disability, we have, you name it, there's something there. And then we developed a blog for health care advocacy, which the grant ended, and we kept the blog because it's pretty easy to keep a blog. You don't have to, they're not that expensive. So there's also stuff that I've transferred to use for the pandemic information, and I try to post things in that every day as well. Next slide. In the speaker's notes, there's a bunch of references. There's a huge amount of information about this topic, and I tried to pick things that would be of some immediate use. In terms of executive function, the first one, self-regulation through assistive technology, is the single best overview of what's available for supporting executive functions I've ever seen, and it's well worth looking at. There's down the list is a third one there, building a technology toolkit for work, school, and in life. It's a guide, and there's also a video that goes with it, but I didn't include the video because it's not on YouTube, and I wasn't entirely sure exactly how to deal with copyright issues. But there should be a link to the video if you want to watch that. It was a webinar, and there was a couple items from that were really interesting. There's a piece of modern information on how executive function develops, and this is where I got the thing about it lasting into, I hope, up to my age at least, 74. And there's also some general information about how paying attention to assistive technology for executive function helps people with cognitive impairments to do and learn what they need in order to have the kinds of lives that they want. There's a few other items as well. I put in a link to MDRC's assistive technology resources, which are huge. There's an awful lot of them. And there's also some tools. There's we participated in a national program called AT for All, and our version of it in Michigan is called AT Exchange, and it's a classifieds for pieces of equipment that the person no longer needs, or that the person they were supporting has died, and the equipment is a remarkable variety, and it's worth looking at AT Exchange if you want something and you don't know how to find it. Along those lines, a common question is how to fund AT, and there's a manual on the AT site that talks you through, and we also will help if you have a specific thing that you want, say a van, for example, that's wheelchair accessible. We have a set of resources that you can use to try to deal with that very tough problem. It shouldn't be accidental that you find a decent van that you can use. Finally, if I was going to pick one thing that's it's accurately named, but it has uses way beyond its original purpose, it would be the Job Accommodation Network. Although the JAN is focused on work, frankly, the accommodations can be used by anybody for anything, and they have an enormous amount of possibilities. So if you're really at a loss and you don't know where to start, I would suggest using a JAN as a place to start, and just look around the site and put in searches and see what pops up, and learn how to do research in the modern connected world. The next slide rather. If you have any last questions.
Hey, Norm.
Yeah.
Before we take questions, I wondered if we could just take a look at this, what was it called? Smart options for people with disabilities. And if I could just share your
Sure.
resource list, and if you could talk about that just for a little bit.
Sure.
Let me pull that up.
Good idea. It's gotten kind of out of hand.
Yeah. Okay. So the smart devices for people with disabilities. So really, how can people use technology to live independently, be safe, that sort of thing.
I touched on it, but there is a whole universe of these things, and they're constantly getting more useful and more accommodating. And I mentioned a couple of small things, like being able to turn lights on and off as a form of personal safety, but they go way beyond this. Both Google and Amazon have their own version, and I've got both of them because I wanted to see what they were like. And they're not identical, obviously, but they cover many of the same things. And Alexa, in particular, has developed a huge library of skills that you can use for a wide variety of things. And I put in some examples of discussions about this. The one that is the most complete is the overview. Voice assistants and smart home technologies transform the lives of people with disabilities and the elderly. But it's a long article and it covers a lot of ground. The other two are kind of like, 7 things you can do with your new Amazon Echo. And the independent living supports thing, that's one of the articles that I put in the bibliography, but there were a couple that I thought were really interesting. Brain in Hand uses both human and digital resources to support, and it's a Canadian project, but it's well worth looking at the site and reading about how they approach that, because there's nothing about it that's specifically Canadian. I mean, you don't have to have a pet moose or anything, so you can use it anywhere. And the other one, which I just thought was, the most common phobia is public presentation. And this is the Present Pal, allows you to build your own personal group of notes and prompts and cues using an accessible development method in order for you to do public presentations. And if there was something that I had to pick out from all the things that human beings do that has automatically produces a sense of personal agency, it's being able to do a public presentation without throwing up. And I've been doing public presentations since the late 1970, and I can tell you that I still get nervous every single time. But I've gotten a lot better at creating them, and I've gotten a lot better at being comfortable with environments in which I don't have any real control over the outcome. And so I can tell you that learning how to do public presentations is really worth your while. The other thing is that in looking at these, I mentioned earlier that there is a support ecosystem for any major assistive technology community. And the ecosystem for these kinds of personal supports in living where you want to is growing very rapidly. And I have to tell you that I don't see a huge difference other than personal preference between the two big players, which are Google and Amazon. And the people who come up, I mentioned the camera that I had looking for the feral cat. There's a large number of these things. That the camera that I'm using was $30, and I've had it now for 2 years, and it's still working. Just it's not a very complicated thing, frankly. It depends on me having a computer. A lot of these things, especially if you can get some assistance in the initial setup, can be generally useful to you for a wide variety of stuff you'd like to do, or to solve problems which you think you can't solve because perhaps sometimes it's because of the disability that the individual has. They don't think there's a solution for that because of the way they look at their disability. And there's also stuff, people with disabilities are always, and myself included, always have to overcome the sense that they are unable to have agency in a certain part of their life. And however true that was at one time, it's not true anymore. There are a great many things that people with disabilities can do now that they couldn't do before, and they're well worth exploring. Is that enough, Vicki?
Yeah, so I have downloaded that resource list into a Word document, and we can email that out to everyone.
Okay.
Who's a part of the session today. Is that okay, Caitlin? Seems like
yeah, absolutely. And then we did have people asking about if they could get a copy of your slides. So Norm, is that okay with you if I send those out as well?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, perfect.
So let's open
the resource list will be expanding as we get better at doing demonstrations around these support areas. So I would hang on to the link just because at some point down the line you might want to check back.
So well, we're going to open up to questions. You can either unmute and ask a question or type it into the chat. Anything specific or general folks have? Or I wondered if anybody has run across a particular assistive technology tool that's really worked out well for someone that they know.
Yeah, I'd like to hear about them, certainly.
I can share a brief one regarding my brother. He recently moved. He had surgery after a fall where he fractured several vertebrae. And so he's less mobile than he used to be. And he wants to be able to, live in this larger room. So we were able to move him into the room. And then the conversation was around phone and how's he going to be able to contact people. And the staff where he lives were like, well, he can use the phone, anytime. We'll just bring it to him and that. But he wants to be able to do that on his own because he's always been able to do that on his own. So we were able to work with a Google Home Mini, and he's able to sit anywhere in his room. He can close the door and have a private conversation. He can sit in the chair and have it call so-and-so. He's given all the family nicknames and it's programmed that way. So he'll say, call Mighty Midget, and it automatically calls my yes, I know. I'm the youngest in the family, so I'm Mighty Midget. So he'll say, call Mighty Midget, and it'll call me. And it also has a video feature. So if I click on my Duo, he can see me while we're talking, and I can see him while we're talking if he's sitting in front of the video. So we're just getting this and trying it out right now. And he's seeming like it's something that he's really going to like doing. In the past, we've, when he was going out into the community more with less assistance, we had various cell phones. And the issue was always, how does he remember to keep the cell phone and not leave it someplace? Right. And so, we looked at Lowtech, like he tends to like to wear his keys on a lanyard. Could we get some sort of pouch that the phone could be in with the same lanyard because he didn't lose his keys? And we discovered it was him trying to push the buttons and getting frustrated. So he wasn't losing it, he was leaving it behind. So in the circular file. And so this is like hands-free, and he can just use his voice. So it's made a huge difference for him.
To add to that, the old way of dealing with voice control was to have what they called an expert system that used rules. And one of the problems with that is that if you had a disability-based accent, you couldn't use it because rules are not you can't do rules for accents. But both Google and Amazon have shifted to an artificial intelligence approach to using speech control, and they're already getting better at allowing people whose voice isn't the standard one to be able to control stuff with their voice. And it's going to get a lot better over the next few years, including, frankly, presentations. A couple of years ago, no, it was longer ago than that. Well, some time ago, maybe 10 years ago, I went to do a panel on autism supports in special education, secondary special education classrooms. And I was one of 5 or 6 people. And one of them was this obviously very young guy. And he was a fellow who had autism and had never spoken with his standard vocal cords and that. And he had an iPad, and he had spent the previous period of time setting up his presentation on that iPad and he ran the whole thing through it, including the voice. And I have to say, we were all really, really impressed with that. And those kinds of capabilities are only going to get better over the next decade.
Other questions, or anybody want to share an experience? All right.
I'm not seeing any hands raised. I can share another quick experience. We had an advocate from the Detroit area coming, this is prior to COVID, obviously, coming to an event here in Lansing, and he'd never been to Lansing before. And so periodically what we would do is, help people schedule their routes, and then we would send a staff to the bus station to pick whoever was coming into Lansing for the event at different times. And this person wanted to do that on his own. So we were able to help program an app in his phone with GPS tracking. We had that conversation with he in a circle. So he came into Lansing for the very first time by himself, and it's maybe 10 or 15 blocks from the bus station to where our office is, where he was going to meet up. And he did that completely on his own with an app on his phone saying, okay, go 10 steps forward, stop, look both ways.
Yeah.
And then, we could see on a map exactly where he was at any time. And he was stationary for a moment, and somebody said, they hadn't heard from him in a few moments, and he was stationary. And then we realized it was the local Bigby's. So he had stopped to get a cup of coffee for the meeting. So we were all laughing. We should all call Bigby's and say, hey, while you're there, pick us up, that kind of thing. We didn't, but he made it to the office, completely on his own, and he'd never been in Lansing before. So, the GPS on, and apps combining or using GPS on phones can be just so helpful in how, getting people from point A to point B.
Thanks, Mary.
I can still remember that it was really, really tough to find. I had a 6-county area when I worked for protection and advocacy in the Thumb, in a million little towns, and I had this big book of Michigan maps, and it had city maps in it. And I spent every day I went out to do advocacy at a local place, I had to spend 45 minutes or an hour figuring out where these places were so that I could get there. And it's hard to, that alone, which is not nearly as sophisticated as what you described, where you were able to track by steps. And just to let you know, there's going to be, over the next 5 years or so, there's going to be a quantum improvement in GPS. So, a better use inside places too as well. That's a really good example, and it's something that people stop from going places because they aren't sure they can get there safely. And that's a great example of how you can do that.
Final thought, Norm?
Just that this is an area that's going to explode even more over the next decade, and it's not so much that you need to become an expert, but you need to know how to ask questions about the things that are important to you or important to the people you're supporting, so that you can find stuff that's of general use to them. And you get good at researching this. If you do it enough, you get good at finding stuff. I would just suggest that it's worth viewing it as a game where you're trying to learn what the rules are from examples, and that you will find that you can find amazing things out there, but you do have to look, and there is a search issue. I was trying to find something today from Google, and I was getting instead of getting what I was looking for, I was getting an endless series of 1,000 pages of camera models. And I couldn't get that to stop doing that, but I eventually was able to figure out a way to stop the camera stuff from showing up, and then there was the thing I was looking for. So it's well worth developing that skill, no matter how old you are, even if you're 74.
Good. Next slide. You got to get wrapped up. So just a reminder, if you want to CEUs, you do have to do the survey, and Caitlin will be putting that in the chat, the link into the chat. And even if you don't want social work CEUs, if you complete the survey, it always helps us with our data and information about our upcoming trainings. Next slide. So we do have 2 more trainings left in our 10-month series. In September, we're going to be talking about healthy relationships, which also includes sex. Sometimes people have a hard time hearing that word, but Mary will be teaching on this topic. It's going to be a fantastic presentation. And then in October, we're going to be doing a session on how peers can support individuals to live in a supported decision-making way. Next slide. As we mentioned, all of our sessions have been recorded and they are on our website. If you go to oaklandchn.org, click on training, then click on, oh boy, I misspelled that. Click on recorded training and you scroll down. You will see supported decision-making series and all of our sessions will be there. July and August, well, July wasn't there, but August they should be there within a week or two. Next slide. Thank you once again for attending our training. We appreciate it. Hope you found it informational, and certainly Norm has given us a ton of resources to explore. Norm, as always, you don't disappoint. You're a wealth of knowledge. You're a wonderful individual, and we really appreciate all the work that you do. So thank you so much, and thanks everybody for attending.
Thanks for the opportunity.